The loss of a parent was one of the things we had in common, and proved a powerful bond. Sometimes we talked to each other about how we felt. We both missed our parents terribly. But while I had basically come to terms with Dad's death, John was still angry about his mother Julia's senseless death in a car accident. I am certain that his bitter rage at his mother's death, and especially at the way she died, was behind so much of his aggression during that period. Music had been an important part of John's relationship with his mother. When she died, he used it to blot out the pain and anger he felt. Julia had bought him his first guitar and loved music. She played the piano and banjo and sat with him patiently for hours, showing him over and over again how to play the chords. She had also introduced John to rock and roll. She would play Elvis Presley records at top volume, grabbing John's hand to drive around the kitchen to them. She always encouraged John's musical dreams. By the time John and I got together, he talked, ate, breathed music. When he wasn't playing his guitar, he was writing lyrics or talking about the latest Lonnie Donegan, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, or Chuck Berry record. Almost every lunchtime, he met the two other quarrymen to rehearse. They were both younger and went to the Liverpool Institute, next door to the Art College, the best known of Liverpool's boys' grammar schools. Distinguished judges and politicians had been educated there. Its pupils were expected to do well, but John's friends, Paul McCartney and George Harrison, were more interested in playing music than passing exams. John had met Paul at a fete at St. Peter's Church in Woolton when the Quarrymen had played there almost 3 years earlier, on July the 6th, 1957. At 14, Paul was a year and 8 months younger than John, a fairly big age gap for teenagers. But when John realised that Paul was a talented musician who knew the words to dozens of hit songs and who could even tune his guitar, which John couldn't, his age was irrelevant. Soon afterward, John sent Paul a message via a friend. "You're in the group." George was a friend of Paul's. They'd started playing guitar together some time previously and practiced at each other's houses. Eventually, Paul introduced him to John. He was 8 months younger than Paul, but a talented guitarist, and in early 1958, John invited him to join the group. When I first met them, I was 19. John was 18, Paul was 17, and George 16. It was about as inconsequential as a meeting can be. Paul and George had come over to the Art College one lunchtime, and John said, "This is Paul and George, and this is Cyn." And they both said hi, and I said hi, and that was it. As John's new girlfriend, they gave me a few curious glances, but then everyone got on with the serious business of making music. From the start, I loved their music. It was fascinating to watch them teach each other new chord sequences, work out the tunes to popular songs, and begin to put together their own. Paul had been first to write a song, but John leapt on the idea, and soon they were writing more and more new stuff. They had one of their first real breaks at the Casbah Club, a venue in the cellar of a house in a Liverpool suburb called West Derby. It belonged to Mona Best, who started the club as a meeting place for her elder son Peter and his friends. They charged a shilling membership to keep out the rough element and served coffee and sweets. Before they opened, Peter suggested to his mum that they ask one of the beat groups that were springing up all over town to come and play there. She agreed, and they invited the Quarrymen. The girl who knew the group had told the Bests how good they were. John, Paul and George went round to see Mona, who told them they were welcome to play, but she was still painting the cellar for the club's opening the following week. The three boys grabbed paintbrushes and helped her finish it off. The boys played at the club's opening on August the 29th, 1959, and I was there to watch them. They played without a drummer as they couldn't find one. About 300 people came along that night, and the boys played rock and roll hits for a couple of hours. The place heaved with kids, jiving and swinging, and the temperature soared until it was hard to breathe. That was the evening when we first met the Beatles' future roadies, Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans, both friends of Pete. But Neil was also his mother's boyfriend and the father of his younger brother, Rogue. Eventually Pete Best decided he wanted to be in a group, got himself a drum kit and formed the Blackjacks with Ken Brown, who left the Quarrymen. They became the Casbah's resident group, and after that the Quarrymen only played there occasionally. By the time I got to know Paul, he and John had formed a close partnership. They had agreed that any songs they wrote together or separately would be by Lennon and McCartney. It was as though even then they had a strong sense that their success depended on the connection between them. Paul's organised, conscientious way of going about things, he wrote down all the lyrics in a notebook he carried with him, was in sharp contrast to John's anything-goes style. Paul turned up for appointments on time, looking well turned out. He was a perfectionist, and you always knew he'd wash behind his ears. John arrived late, looking as though he'd just fallen out of bed. But they complemented each other. John needed Paul's attention to detail and persistence. Paul needed John's anarchic, lateral thinking. When they wrote songs together, Paul's gentler melodies blended beautifully with John's more rousing, challenging tunes and lyrics. In those days, Paul tried hard to impress John, posing and strutting with his hair slicked back to prove that he was cool, because John was very much the leader. It was his band, and he had the final say about who got in and who didn't and what they played. Then he was everything Paul wanted to be, laid back, self-assured, and in charge. As the schoolboy he still was, Paul could only aspire to these things. As the two became closer, this changed. John recognized Paul's musical talent and that he could learn from him. Paul responded by becoming more confident, and they came to share decisions and eventually ran the group together. But John, I suspect, always had the edge because he had formed the group and neither of them forgot it. Paul was one of the three people John was closest to. Although he had plenty of cronies, he only let down his guard with Paul, me and Stuart Sutcliffe. Slight, dark and intense, Stuart was serious and hard-working, unlike John, who played the lazy loon. Everyone knew that Stuart was a gifted artist who would go far. He even had a private commission for a painting, unheard of for a student. When John saw his large, colourful canvases, he loved them and longed to try something similar. Before that, he had limited himself to the cartoons and caricatures he drew so brilliantly, and which had got him into college. What Stuart and John had in common was a restless, speedy nature. But while John bounced from one idea to the next, never able to settle or concentrate for long, Stuart put all his energy into being a star pupil. He was only 3 months older than John, but he was a year ahead in college and encouraged John to experiment in his art. Stuart respected John and treated him as an equal, which was something John valued a great deal. Stuart and I got on well. I was in awe of his talent, but he was amusing and good company too. I was glad John had a friend who took art seriously, but I never saw him as anything more than a mate who hung around with John and me. One night we were at a party, and John went mad when someone told him Stuart and I were dancing together. As soon as I saw the look on John's face, we stopped, and as so often before, I reassured him that it was him I loved, and he seemed to accept it. For the next day at college, he followed me to the girls' loos in the basement. When I came out, he was waiting, with a dark look on his face. Before I could speak, he raised his arm and hit me across the face, knocking my head into the pipes that ran down the wall behind me. Without a word, he walked away, leaving me dazed, shaky, and with a very sore head. I was shocked, really shocked, that John had been physically violent. I could put up with his outbursts, the jealousy and possessiveness, but violence was a step too far. Phil had been right. I knew I had to end our relationship.